Disclaimer: the views and opinions expressed by the speaker in this podcast are solely those of the speaker and do
Metaverse covers companies, technologies, and trends that are bringing these promises to life. Join creator and host Jonathan Ross Friedman, founder and CEO of Super Social, as he interviews the brilliant minds that are building, shaping, and investing in the metaverse.
Welcome to Into the Metaverse. I'm Jan, and joining me today is Sam Purifoy, partner and head of Interactive at Hivemind, an investment firm focused on Web3 and blockchain companies. Sam is also the...
Sure. I think it's a complex and loaded question, but where I sit is that the metaverse is actually a set of emergent standards, and those standards dictate the way that we interact with the digital environment. So to me, the metaverse is not so much, Facebook putting out a VR headset or Apple putting out a VR out of a purely digital environment. So that's a combination of technologies like AR, VR, blockchain, et cetera. It's things where we can come to a public consensus around these standards, and we say this is fair play and fair game for interacting in this next age, of digitalization. I think it's important to keep in mind too, the way that the internet originally came about as a set of experiments between a small set of counterparties, and then really expanded into kind of the global and open phenomenon
about the internet in 3D. And when I think about the internet as a user-owned internet, meaning we as the people can have a much more equitable sense of ownership around what is happening is the digital platforms. And I think part of the rise of Web3 was really kind of as a contradiction to, or a different point of view on the internet needing to be something that is open, interoperable, where I can truly own and carry my digital assets with me. But at the same time, it feels like a lot of people are kind of colluding together these two things of what does the internet look like as a 3D environment, because that has nothing to do with user-owned internet, right? We can still have a 3D internet that is powered by, let's say, 2-3 big platforms, very much in line with what we're seeing in movies like, Ready Player one big conglomerate, and then the rest of us are kind of fighting against it. How do you distinct in the work you do between those two paradigms, and to what extent do you think deterministically they have to come together to enable said quote-unquote metaverse?
Yeah, I think I'm going to index a little bit on the, big corporate overlord takes over the world, and we all have to sit within their version of the metaverse, because I think that, frankly, that's what scares people the most. And I think that it's what's most pertinent today, as we do have these massive tech giants, Facebook, Apple, et cetera, who are pushing, their own agendas and objectives and trying to capture that part of the market. I think that in reality, in the short term, just as we saw with the original internet, this emergent, new metaverse, right, if we can call it that, this new 3D and user ownership focused and economic focused version of the internet, it may be controlled by a set of small counterparties. It may be, controlled by just 2 to 3 who can opt in and who have both the technology and the economic wherewithal to get ahead of the curve. But in the long run, I think that this is at least my interpretation of human nature. We have a tendency to push at the edges of things and find where the holes are. And ultimately, the only way to kind of stop that type of behavior and enable it in a way where it's a little bit more constructive than it is destructive is to just settle on a set of open standards, which is ultimately how the internet was born today. So it was originally, a set of defense experiments, and then finally it came into the public view. We settled on open standards, and now everybody interacts with the internet. Similarly, here with the next evolution of, the metaverse and digitization, we're going to see a set of large private counterparties who own the entire space. You will not be able to budge them in any direction. They will have absolute say over everything that we do inside of those worlds. But over time, their edge will be worn away, and a set of more open standards will be developed, and then more people will be able to come in and develop along those sides of the open standards. And it's my opinion that this is an inevitability, as opposed to just something that we can dream about and hope that the big corporate overlords, if you will, allow it to happen, because ultimately, they do not have the ability to produce the volume of content and control every aspect of the internet that will, allow for 7 billion people across the world to really, really embrace this new age of digitization. So the net for me sits on the side of, yes, in the near term, we may have a situation like Ready Player One, right? There may be some, giant Oasis type, entity who controls everything. But again, in the long term, it's going to continue to trend just towards standardization. And this will be, the next set of base internet protocols will, have to deal with VR, AR, economic ownership, et cetera, and how do we present data to users, and then how do they also have ownership or control over that data?
Yeah, I mean, look, the thought of what I would describe at the moment, the provocative thought of a user user-owned internet where these corporate overlords are a smaller portion of what actually drives the economic engine of the internet. At this point of time, with what we've seen over the past 20, 25 years, I would say is not only provocative, but it also not in line with what we're actually seeing. However, I think what's also happening is that what you just described, technology is unleashing a whole new power of creativity where really everyone can create something. And more than that, we're seeing a whole new environment where people not only creating, but actually looking to monetize and create a living of what they're creating digitally. And so I think to your point, it's going to be incredibly interesting to see what point we're going to have that inflection point where those large platforms like Meta, like Facebook, right? Even other closed platforms that we would think of as closed, like Roblox and so on and so forth. At what point of time people actually push for things that are more open? The challenge I see with that, and I'm curious on your POV, is ultimately what we've seen over the last 20 years. One of the reasons big platforms like Facebook, now Meta, became so large, one of the reasons Google is so good, one of the reasons Amazon is so successful, one of the reasons Apple almost essentially monopolized consumer technology is because they made it very simple for people to use. They made it very simple for people to produce information, to consume, to interact. Don't you think there is a little correlation between the more simplified we make the internet to use, the easier it is for platform to take control? And if yes, how do you think that could ultimately change when people, at the end of the day, most people really want comfort and easy life?
Yeah, it is an extraordinarily difficult question. And I think it's definitely prescient to note that, the Apples, the Googles, the Microsofts, et cetera, those giant tech stacks of the world, in part got to where they are because they vertically integrated. So they own both our hardware as well as our software. So everything that we use in some part is theirs and they control it. Going forward, into this kind of next age, it's unlikely, first of all, that everyone is going to control their own blockchain node, for example. There are projects that push that into your phone, right, where you can control your own node and be part of a larger network, but they're not really proven out to the degree where everyone is walking around, running their own kind of consensus node. So I think I broadly agree with you that first and foremost, UX, the user experience of the situation is going to be what keeps people out, of this new age of digitization, of this, metaverse type concept for the foreseeable future. But again, drawing parallels back to the original internet, just then you had to physically hook up cords to different machines to get them to talk to each other. That's basically where we're at today with economic ownership in a digital capacity. You have to physically hook up individual blockchain nodes to the internet, run those nodes, and it's a process. It's a mess. Over time, again, that will, by a set of different progress as well as commercial incentives for people to actually push through, that will become easier and easier. And we may get to the point where ultimately owning a digital asset is the same as you owning a piece of paper or any physical asset, right? You just have that and it's held either in your phone, or it's, saved in your checking account, et cetera. But the net is that at the end, you really do end up with a world where in the near term, very clunky, very messy. We are literally plugging cords together to try to make this thing work. But in the long term, as we converge on a set of standards, it's unlikely to me that we end up in a spot where just the Google, just the Apple, just the Facebook want to or even can feasibly control that full set of standards as well as the full set of, software and creative development that's going to exist outside of their own corporate remit.
So I want to switch gears and roll up our sleeves and get our hand dirty a bit. 2020, 2021 especially, and also to some extent, first half of 2022, we've seen this extraordinary explosion of a new primitive called NFTs, which is, a protocol built on blockchain that essentially gives everyone a true ownership of a certain digital asset that they can resell, own, do things with, build IP, and there's a lot of murky water around it. I don't want to get too much into that detail, but what I am interested in hearing your perspective as someone who is in, Hivemind is a firm that is focused on making investment in Web3, blockchain, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think, and what's your interpretation of reality of really what we've been through in that first wave of Web3? And where do you think we're heading when we're going to get out of that, winter?
So I think that the first wave was categorized by a ton of hype over something that was very poorly categorized by both consumers, issuers, and regulators, frankly. So this idea of an NFT, and I'm going to have a longer piece coming out about this perhaps next week if legal clears it, because there's a lot of commentary around what regulators are doing here. But anyway, NFTs as a whole are literally a standard. That is by definition what an NFT is. A non-fungible token functions generally on an ERC 721 standard is what the norm is over on the Ethereum network. And people got really excited in 2021 because this notion of you can own a digital asset, you can own a picture truly, it's a powerful concept. The concept that you can collect, a Pokemon card that's not just physical now, it's permanent, it's digital, and you truly have ownership. Unfortunately, what happened was a ton of miscommunication around what an NFT is and what an NFT is not. So, for example, some of those components were, this NFT will make you a ton of money just because it is an NFT and the line always goes up. That is something that issuers were communicating to retail and was patently false. And so it led to this huge hype cycle. But where this is going in the future is recognition that NFTs are, frankly, the same as basically a piece of paper. They are whatever you write on them. They are a blank certificate. It is a set of standards and communication tools that we use to dictate to other people what our sides of the contract say. So if I sell you an NFT that says that it gives you rights to some, set of revenues on some project that I'm building, that is a very different NFT than if I just take a picture of, my cat and I upload that as an NFT and I sell that to you as well. They are both functionally pieces of paper is how I would describe them. One of them has a purpose written on top of it, and one of them is just a picture. But to the public, the word NFT means the same thing, and they can't differentiate between those two cases. So unfortunately, where we sit right now is there is still so much confusion, and all three counterparties, be that retail, regulators, as well as builders, are issuing a ton of confusion into the market because they are all using NFTs in exactly the same way. When they say NFT, they just mean a blanket statement for anything that happens to be a digital asset, and it's all just as messy as the other. But in reality, it would be like me going out and issuing a statement about all pieces of paper are, potentially dangerous and you need to be careful about which pieces of paper you're looking at. It's true, it's a patently obvious fact, but you have to read what is actually written on the certificate, what is actually written inside of, the instruments and the digital representation. So where I see this going in the future is, again, kind of back to my original point, is that we will start using these as a set of standards, which is what they are and it's what they're intended to be, and we'll build modular components on top so that this NFT is a collectible picture standard, and this NFT is a contract standard, and this NFT is a stock standard. They are just a digital representation of owning some component of the real physical world that's mapped, into the electronic world. So, the confusion that we've seen to date is really a consequence of everyone trying to vie for that same small slice of the pie. But in reality, we should be looking at this for what it is, which is it's just a standards tool at the end of the day.
I think that's a great way to simplify what has been happening with NFTs. I think my interpretation, if I may add, was that it was one of those remarkable human nature phenomena around just making money. I mean, just let's call it what it is. I think there was a very small portion of people who are philosophically pumped about a world of a user-owned internet and actually understand what it means and the complexities. Also, there is no user-owned internet if there is no interoperability.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Interoperability is really important, and I think that is another concept that haven't been effectively demystified for the wider community. I mean, if you're going to go to Washington, D.C. and talk about interoperability at Congress, I think 99.9% of people are probably going to look at you and say, what is interoperability, right? And I think we're looking at amazing things that are happening now, but actually, who are the companies that are working on interoperability in terms of standards? We have the Metaverse Standards Forum. We have the Open Alliance of USD, which is Universal Scene Description, which is an amazing technology built by Pixar years ago that they made open source. And who established the Open USD? Apple and Pixar, right? And a bunch of other, NVIDIA, and a bunch of other big companies. And so I'm curious, again, going back to that point, which I know you don't have answers, but I think that's what I'm really excited to see where this is going. A lot of those principles, a lot of those protocols that will enable decentralized, interoperable internet, ultimately potentially evolving to a metaverse, by definition, a lot of these are going to be built by big companies. in the past, when we look at the internet 60, 70 years ago, a lot of these protocols were not built by commercial companies. They were built by armies, by militaries, by nations, by governments who by definition were not seeking bottom line shareholder return on investment. How do we, and here it may be as with your hat as an investor, although I know it's on a venture stage, how do we tackle that? What are the parameters that will enable protocols to be built by large commercial entities, but how do we ensure that they don't take advantage of those protocols that they're building to actually benefit their shareholders versus the wider global population? Big question.
Yeah. No, it's okay. It's a huge question. So this tackles on the topic of, the viability of open source software inside of a venture or a corporate model. And what we've actually seen over the past, I would say, decade to 2 decades at this point, is that open source software actually continues to proliferate, and there is a substantial advantage to the companies who do open source their software and enable, different builders to actually build on top of their standards. As very small cases in point, there have been a number of large corporates who have either released, software frameworks, be that Facebook with React, et cetera, or, other kind of more behind the scenes frameworks that basically get everyone on the same page as them, and it gives them a substantial corporate tailwind because now everyone is building in exactly the same direction as they are, except they're the leader. So there are, concerns, and some of these are voiced around, things like the Ethereum Foundation, et cetera, groups who do have substantial holdings of, the initial economic ownership and still hoping to push a set of open public standards. It's a complex set of questions around, is open source actually viable inside of a venture or corporate model? From my position, the answer is yes. I actually think that open source is a viable way to, bootstrap a new movement and a set of standards, which you can then capture a tailwind on the back of and hope to monetize in front of. But I don't think that it net always has to lead to a situation where you have one giant corporate conglomerate who has pushed out a set of open source software and is now the only actor in the space and has prevented anyone else from actually entering. I think it's actually a way to, frankly, get more people on the same page as you and give yourself quite a bit more lift before having to actually work on monetizing what you've built out of the open source component.
Switching gears to talk a bit about kind of taking a longer term view of the landscape, right? And I think you have now been, and I think maybe it would be beneficial, I think, for our audience to also hear just for a couple of minutes, what has been the focus of Hivemind as a firm since the founding of the firm a couple of years ago? And more importantly, what I would love to hear more is, how do you guys look at the landscape today when we think about Web3 in terms of investment opportunities? And what are the ventures that you're seeing that are actually gaining traction, not only with respect to the crypto winter and the Web3 winter we're experiencing at the moment, but also just in the general venture landscape that at the moment is basically very different from only 12 months ago?
Sure. So at a high level, Hivemind is a multi-strategy firm. We participate in every component of the Web3 economy, be that, liquid trading to staking to proper venture. To date, we've seen a number of theses hold quite a lot of water, both with counterparty investors as well as, retail entrants, et cetera. And those are some of the core base philosophies behind the initial Web3 movement. So those are things like, digital assets as a safe haven away from fiat currencies. That continues to hold weight, both with institutional investors as large as Fidelity, BlackRock, et cetera, who continue to allocate resources in exactly that direction, mostly through Bitcoin. But then we also see, strong retail narratives emerging, principally, frankly, around gaming and metaverse type applications, ways where the notion of owning something inside of a digital landscape is already one-to-one with their user experience. Inside of games, they already feel like they own assets. The notion of truly owning them on top of a blockchain, it holds weight with a certain niche of retail users. Beyond that, there's a couple narratives that have been emerging, but frankly, they haven't caught a ton of wind quite yet. So DeFi is the one that is probably first and foremost. Decentralized finance is a phenomenal force of nature when it works, which is that, you can transact with counterparties, you can perform different, loans, as well as, levered bets, et cetera. You can do an entire plethora of things inside of a transaction framework that is completely trustless. So you do not have to trust your counterparty in any capacity. The problem with DeFi, unfortunately, is that DeFi, from my perspective at least, is very difficult to pitch to your ordinary consumer on the sidewalk. It's very hard to tell them, that they should go into an automated market maker like Uniswap, make a trade and then go post that to Aave, or Curve or something and yield farm. So DeFi is something that faces, from my perspective, quite a bit more headwind from the ordinary commercial consumer. But when you look at more consumer-facing products, things like gaming, frankly, that's, in my opinion, where there's a lot of near-term potential. We have to get over the philosophical hump, though, of it's kind of a dual hump between solving for the user experience around how does an ordinary retail consumer get into a Web3 experience without this enormous friction around having to deal with your wallet, having to deal with your secret phrase, et cetera. But then secondly, how do we explain to them, that it really matters? Because there are a small subset of people that understand owning a digital asset is super important. But then frankly, there's a much, much larger group of people who, they're still not, really seeing that as the proper direction. And to my knowledge, frankly, that's a miseducation on our part, and we should be doing a better job to really explain why it's important to own everything, that you think you own in a digital capacity.
Sam, I mean, there's just so much to unpack in this conversation, but we're keeping it, pretty tight in terms of the time. But maybe there's going to be a take 2, take 3, because I think each of these components is so large. I do agree and resonate with, and I think this is maybe the main message that I have, is how early we are when we think about metaverse. But really, when you start looking at specific components, like we talked about, virtual worlds in 3D, a user-owned platform where we actually have a stake in the economic activity that is taking place. And not just because we're buying a bunch of skins and we can resell them. We're actually are part of a wider marketplace that is interoperable. And so super, super early. With that in mind, Sam, what are you most excited about for the next 12 months?
I remain super excited about gaming. I mean, you're talking about early. Look, the first crypto game was really compiled sometime in 2017, 2018. After that, venture capital and commercial interest only entered the space in 2021. Game development timelines are 24 to 36 months on the conservative end. That means that we're only just now going to be able to start queuing up games that will come out in the next year or so that have been in progress for the past 2 years. So to me, the focus remains very singular, which is how do we get an ordinary consumer to participate inside of Web3 games and really see, the benefits of blockchain in that type of a digital capacity. So games is the one word for me there.
All right. Well, we're excited because that's what we do at Super Social, and I agree. And this reminds me of a sentence from a former guest on the podcast, Ryan, who said that in a way, the metaverse at the moment is kind of the internet built by game developers. And it's kind of interesting because it is kind of pretty much that at the moment. I wonder, is that really what it's going to be always? And what does that mean if the internet actually looks like one big giant video game? I know there are companies that have a similar vision, anywhere from Improbable to the other side by Yuga Labs and so on and so forth. But again, we're so super early, not just in the creation of some games that prove the use case, but also just more generally, the protocol, the platforms. You mentioned Uniswap. 90% of the world's humanity will hear you say Uniswap, and they would be like, is that a fashion brand? And so I think that's kind of where we are, and we need to recognize that while continuing to lay foundations. Sam, thanks so much for joining. Thanks so much for joining. This has been great.
All right. Well, no, really appreciate you having me on, Jan. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Into the Metaverse. We hope you learned a lot and explored new aspects of the metaverse.